Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel Eagle Discovery. Today we've got breaking news from Venezuela. President Nicolás Maduro's re-election has sparked massive protests across the country, and tensions are rising. In this video, we'll break down what's happening after his victory. Let's get into it. Venezuelan elections, a bitter victory. On July 30th, the National Electoral Council of Venezuela officially declared President Nicolás Maduro the winner of the presidential elections, granting him a third term in office. According to the council's president, Elvis Amoroso, the elections were held in full compliance with the country's constitution and electoral laws, ensuring that the process followed the established legal framework. Maduro secured 51.2% of the total votes, while his main challenger, Mundo González Urrua, garnered 44.2%, marking a significant margin, but one that still reflected considerable opposition within the electorate. This victory represents a crucial milestone for Maduro, who has been in power since the death of his predecessor, Hugo Chávez, in 2013. Over the course of his leadership, Maduro has navigated numerous political, economic, and social challenges that have polarized the nation. Venezuela has been mired in a severe economic crisis, characterized by runaway inflation, widespread poverty, and shortages of basic goods such as food, medicine, and fuel. Despite these hardships, Maduro has managed to retain control, partly through his loyal support base, and partly through his political alliances with other regional leaders, such as those in Russia, China, and Iran. Hey there, where are you from? I want to know which city you're watching our video from. Please leave a comment so we don't feel lonely. A small action like this will motivate us to make more videos. Thank you and much love to you. Maduro's previous victory in 2018 was highly controversial. He won that election with almost 68% of the vote, but the elections were heavily criticized both domestically and internationally. There were widespread allegations of voter manipulation, the exclusion of opposition parties, and accusations of voter intimidation. Many countries, including the United States, the European Union, and several Latin American nations, refused to recognize the results of the 2018 election, labeling it a sham. The most recent election, held on July 28th, was no less contentious. The campaign was marked by widespread protests and accusations of election fraud. Opposition parties and critics claimed that the electoral process was biased and that Maduro's government used state resources to secure his victory. There were also claims of voter suppression, including the intimidation of opposition supporters and the removal of key candidates from the ballot. Despite this, the National Electoral Council declared Maduro the legitimate winner, citing the results as a reflection of the will of the people. Maduro, who is now 61 years old, remains a highly divisive figure. He is adored by some for his defiant stance against foreign interference, particularly from the United States, and for his promises to safeguard Venezuela's sovereignty and resources. On the other hand, many critics argue that his policies have exacerbated the country's crises, leading to a dramatic decline in living standards for the Venezuelan people. The country has witnessed mass emigration, with millions fleeing to neighboring countries in search of better economic opportunities and safety. The international community continues to debate the legitimacy of Maduro's rule, and while some countries have pledged to stand by him, others have imposed economic sanctions, hoping to pressure him into political concessions. At the same time, Venezuela's economy continues to struggle with hyperinflation, which has made the local currency nearly worthless, and the country faces challenges in securing basic goods for its citizens. Maduro's administration has implemented various measures, including currency redenominations and food distribution programs, but these have failed to reverse the country's dire economic situation. Now, as Maduro enters his third term, he faces the task of navigating both domestic unrest and international isolation. His supporters argue that he has been unfairly targeted by external forces, and that Venezuela's problems are the result of a U.S.-led campaign to destabilize the country. Meanwhile, his detractors continue to call for reforms and the restoration of democratic processes, criticizing Maduro for undermining Venezuela's political institutions and silencing opposition voices. Both his supporters and critics continue to debate the fairness of the election, with some arguing that the vote was a genuine reflection of the people's will, while others contend that it was a rigged process designed to ensure his continued grip on power. As Maduro embarks on his third term, the future of Venezuela remains uncertain, with the country's deep economic crisis, political polarization, and social unrest showing no signs of abating. All right. If you're new to this channel, Eagle Discovery warmly welcomes you. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and remember to turn on the notification bell to catch our upcoming content. The aftermath. Protests and riots erupt. The announcement of Nicolás Maduro's victory in the presidential election sent shockwaves through Venezuela, leading to widespread outrage and a swift, intense backlash from the public. From the moment the results were announced, protests erupted in cities across the country, particularly in Venezuela's largest urban centers like Caracas, Maracaibo, and Valencia. What started as peaceful demonstrations soon spiraled into violent confrontations as citizens from all walks of life, students, workers, professionals, and families, flooded the streets to demand change. They expressed their anger, not only over what they believed were fraudulent election results, but also over years of hardship under Maduro's regime. Many accused the government of manipulating the election process to secure a victory, and claimed that their voices were being silenced in a system that had become increasingly undemocratic. The protests quickly escalated into full-blown riots as frustration boiled over. The sound of gunfire could be heard echoing through the streets of major cities as demonstrators clashed with security forces. Tear gas was deployed, and rubber bullets fired at crowds as police and military units moved in to try to suppress the unrest. In some areas, protesters fought back fiercely, hurling rocks, Molotov cocktails, and setting up barricades made of burning tires and other debris. There were reports of street battles, with protesters and police exchanging gunfire, leaving many injured and, in some cases, dead. The protests were not just about a single election, but rather about the broader frustration that had been simmering for years. Venezuela has been suffering through one of the worst economic crises in its history, which many blame on the policies of Maduro's government. Hyperinflation, which had already skyrocketed for years, continued to ravage the country. The bolívar, Venezuela's currency, lost value at an alarming rate, making everyday goods increasingly unaffordable for ordinary Venezuelans. Unemployment was rampant, and the country faced severe shortages of basic necessities such as food, medicine, and clean drinking water. People stood in long lines for hours just to buy essentials, but often left empty-handed due to the lack of availability. The country's public healthcare system was also on the brink of collapse, with hospitals lacking necessary supplies and equipment to treat the sick. This economic instability, combined with the government's inability or unwillingness to address the crisis, created an environment of widespread anger and distrust toward Maduro's leadership. Many Venezuelans saw his re-election as a further indication that the government had no intention of making the necessary reforms to address the country's issues. The discontent was particularly strong among the younger generation, who felt they had no future in their own country. Thousands of students took to the streets to protest not only against Maduro's administration, but also against a political system they believed had failed them. As these protests grew in size and intensity, so did the violence. In many cases, protesters confronted heavily armed soldiers and police in the streets, leading to clashes that left behind a trail of destruction. The government, in turn, responded with increasingly harsh measures to suppress the uprisings. Military and police forces were deployed throughout the country to control the chaos, with orders to use force if necessary. In some regions, reports of mass arrests, forced disappearances, and even torture surfaced, adding to the already tense atmosphere. International reaction to the unrest was swift, with many countries and organizations condemning the violence and calling for peaceful dialogue. Some regional governments, particularly in Latin America, openly sided with the protesters, while others, like Russia and China, expressed support for Maduro. The United Nations and the Organization of American States both called for calm and urged both sides to engage in negotiations to avoid further bloodshed. For many, this was not just another round of protests. It was a tipping point in Venezuela's long-running political and economic crisis. People were fed up with the broken promises, the lack of food, the collapsing infrastructure, and the constant instability. To them, the re-election of Maduro was the final straw. They were no longer willing to accept a government that they believed had abandoned them. It was a cry for help from a nation on the brink, struggling to hold on to its identity and future. As the violence continued, many feared that the situation could escalate further. People from all parts of society, including those who had once supported Maduro, began to question whether his leadership could truly bring the change Venezuela so desperately needed. And while the government maintained that it was acting to preserve order, the increasing scale of the unrest painted a different picture, one of a deeply divided nation, with no easy solutions in sight. The protests and riots would become a pivotal moment in Venezuela's ongoing struggle for survival, one that could determine the country's political future for years to come. Maduro's response, a promise of unity and stability. In his victory speech, President Nicolás Maduro addressed his supporters with deep gratitude, thanking them for their trust and support. He assured them that he would continue his policies and work tirelessly toward the development of the country. Maduro emphasized, "I accept the mandate of the Venezuelan people to continue leading our country." This statement reinforced his commitment to his presidency, but also to the idea that he represents the will of the people, despite the turbulence surrounding the election. He called for unity and for all Venezuelans to focus on building a better future, one that would overcome the challenges facing the nation. Maduro urged his supporters to remain hopeful, even as protests and unrest erupted across the streets of major cities, a reflection of the frustration and discontent that many Venezuelans felt. He presented his vision as one of stability, pledging that his government would continue to push for policies aimed at lifting the country out of its economic crisis, which has been exacerbated by years of sanctions and mismanagement. But the reality is that not everyone in Venezuela agrees with Maduro's leadership, and many remain skeptical of his promises. The opposition, which includes key figures like González Urrua, has voiced strong objections to the legitimacy of the election, accusing the government of manipulating the voting process. They claim that widespread fraud, voter intimidation, and government interference during the election skewed the results and deprived Venezuelans of a fair democratic process. These allegations are not new. Many opposition leaders have repeatedly pointed to similar tactics in previous elections, which have led to growing distrust in the electoral system. The accusations of fraud have not only led to political tension, but have also ignited more unrest, with protests and demonstrations intensifying. As political divisions deepen, both sides are becoming more entrenched, with Maduro's supporters defending the integrity of the election and his critics calling for his resignation. The ongoing protests, often met with heavy-handed responses from security forces, have caused further instability and highlighted the deep rift within the country. Maduro's government has worked hard to shift the narrative by emphasizing the importance of maintaining national stability and addressing Venezuela's severe economic challenges. The country has been grappling with hyperinflation, skyrocketing unemployment, shortages of food, medicine, and other essentials, and a crumbling infrastructure. Maduro has pledged to address these issues, but critics argue that his government's approach has been ineffective. They point to Venezuela's continued economic decline, its mounting debt, and the growing suffering of the general population as evidence that Maduro's leadership is not producing real solutions. Critics also argue that while Maduro talks about rebuilding the country, his government seems more focused on preserving its own grip on power than on implementing meaningful reforms that could alleviate the hardships facing the Venezuelan people. The opposition accuses Maduro of using state resources to secure his position, maintaining control through the military, and silencing dissenting voices, rather than genuinely working to improve the economic and social conditions that have left millions of Venezuelans struggling. In addition, international pressure has mounted against Maduro's government, with many foreign governments and international organizations calling the election results into question. Sanctions, most notably from the United States and the European Union, have added to the country's economic woes. But critics argue that Maduro has used these sanctions as a rallying cry, positioning himself as a defender of Venezuela's sovereignty. The economic collapse and widespread poverty have driven millions of Venezuelans to flee the country in search of better opportunities abroad, a situation that has further fueled the tensions. Despite all the challenges and divisions, Maduro has managed to maintain control over the country's most powerful institutions, including the military, which is seen as a key pillar of his rule. His ability to stay in power in the face of widespread opposition and international condemnation has been largely attributed to his political maneuvering, alliances with allies such as Russia and China, and his ability to present himself as a symbol of resistance against foreign intervention. The situation in Venezuela remains uncertain, and with the political landscape growing more polarized, it is unclear what path the country will take in the future. Maduro's promises of unity and stability have not been enough to heal the deep wounds in Venezuelan society, and his critics continue to call for change. The nation's path forward will depend on whether the political divisions can be bridged, and whether Maduro's government can demonstrate that it is truly capable of addressing the country's many pressing issues, or if new leadership will emerge to chart a different course for Venezuela's future. The international response: global reactions to Venezuela's election crisis. As the political situation in Venezuela continues to evolve, international reactions are flooding in from across the globe. Many Western governments, including the United States, Canada, and members of the European Union, have expressed deep skepticism about the legitimacy of the elections. They have called for a thorough and independent investigation into the election process, urging transparency and accountability. These governments have also called on President Nicolás Maduro to engage in a meaningful dialogue with the opposition, emphasizing the need for a peaceful and democratic resolution to the political crisis. The United States, in particular, has condemned the election results and has maintained stringent sanctions against the Venezuelan government, accusing Maduro of undermining democracy and human rights. The European Union, while less vocal than the U.S., has also voiced concerns about the fairness of the electoral process and has expressed support for the Venezuelan people's right to choose their leaders freely. On the other hand, countries like Russia and China have strongly supported Maduro's government, recognizing his election victory and offering continued assistance. Both Russia and China view Venezuela as an important ally in Latin America. Russia, for instance, has long had economic and military ties to Venezuela, and both countries have discussed cooperation in areas such as energy, military technology, and trade. China, too, has significant investments in Venezuela's oil and natural gas sectors, making it a key player in the country's economic landscape. These countries have used their diplomatic influence to shield Maduro's government from Western sanctions and condemnation, offering political backing as well as aid to stabilize the country. This division in international opinion reflects the broader geopolitical struggle over influence in Venezuela, a country rich in oil reserves and strategically important in the region. Venezuela's vast oil wealth has made it a critical player in the energy sector, with both Western powers and emerging economies like China and Russia competing for access and influence. As a result, the international community remains deeply divided on how to address the crisis, with some nations backing Maduro's government and others calling for his removal. What's next for Venezuela? As protests and civil unrest continue to escalate, the situation in Venezuela remains highly volatile. The streets of Caracas and other cities are filled with demonstrators, some calling for regime change, while others demand the government address urgent economic and social issues. President Nicolás Maduro has vowed to continue leading the country, promising stability and economic recovery, but it's clear that the nation is deeply divided. Maduro's supporters argue that he is the legitimate president, while opposition leaders and protesters assert that his government is undemocratic and corrupt. The protests are a clear indication that a significant portion of the population feels marginalized and unheard. Many Venezuelans are frustrated by the ongoing economic hardship, hyperinflation, food shortages, and lack of basic services. For years, the country has struggled with a deepening economic crisis, and these protests reflect widespread dissatisfaction with the government's handling of the situation. The coming weeks and months will likely determine whether Maduro's government can regain control or if the unrest will escalate even further. Maduro has promised to address the country's problems, but many are skeptical of his ability to bring meaningful change. There is a real possibility that the situation could deteriorate further, with violent crackdowns on protests and continued political and social instability. Additionally, the long-term effects of this political crisis on the Venezuelan people cannot be overlooked. Venezuela is already grappling with one of the worst economic crises in recent history, with millions of people fleeing the country in search of better opportunities. If the protests continue or grow in size, the already fragile economy could be further destabilized, making it even harder for Venezuelans to rebuild their nation. The future of Venezuela hinges on whether a peaceful resolution can be reached, or whether the country will continue to spiral into further chaos. With many Venezuelans desperate for change, the situation remains uncertain, and the international community is watching closely. The stakes are high not only for the Venezuelan people, but also for regional and global stability. The outcome of this crisis will have lasting repercussions for Venezuela, its neighbors, and the broader international community. A turning point for Venezuela? As we wrap up, it's clear that the situation in Venezuela is at a critical turning point. The country's future remains uncertain, and the challenges ahead will test both the government and the people. Will Maduro's promises of unity be enough to quell the growing protests, or will Venezuela continue to be caught in the whirlwind of political and economic instability? Only time will tell, but one thing is for sure: the world is watching closely as this crisis unfolds. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on this developing story and other global news. Until next time, stay informed, stay safe, and take care.